Hi, this is a lecture on Emily Dickinson, her life and times. So let's first know our poet and let's know why Emily Dickinson is such a celebrated poet of American literature. Um, so one of the things that Emily Dickinson is really well known for is the fact that she is very unconventional as a poet. Um, we notice in her poetry extensive use of capitalization, dots, dashes, etc. And even her vocabulary is extremely unique and different for her times. And She is, in a way, a pioneer of many poetic conventions which were later on taken up by modern poets, modernist poets. So as a poet, she is very unique for the images she builds and for also the way she writes. And this is for a good measure for people who don't know of Emily Dickinson at all. This is one of her poems which would really stand out for the image that she builds. This is an image. This is a poem about hope, which she imagines as something which has feathers, and she talks about hope as a bird which which just perches whenever in the hardest of time, in the harshest of circumstances. And so the image that she's built is extremely resonant. It would really be it's very understandable to people who do not have much of an ear for poetry as well. And we notice also the unconventional poetic devices that she's using. We look at the extensive use of dashes. Now, these dashes are kind of a mix between it's a little more than a comma, but a little less than a full stop. And maybe also she wants to use the dash as a way to show how the mind thinks. And so she would use these poetic devices very often. And the other thing that she's, of course, very well known for is the fact that when she is writing, you do not have as many female poets, and she isn't writing to get published, but when she is writing, you do not have as many examples of other female poets, and that also makes her stand out amongst her contemporaries. And of course, the last thing that we know about her is also the fact that through her life, she spent it towards the end of her life. She, spent it mostly relegated to her home, and she would wear white and she would be called the myth. She would not go out. Of course, she would correspond with the rest of the world. She's extremely prolific in her writings. When she writes to her contemporaries, she writes letters. She gets those letters back. She writes to them again. So we have a lot of interaction that people have had with Emily Dickinson, but this is mostly in the form of the epistolatory form. So that's how we know Emily Dickinson as a poet. Um, so let's just talk about who Emily Dickinson was in order to understand her poetry better. So her early life and family was she was born in 1830s in Amherst, Massachusetts, and she lived a longish life for that time. So it's more than 50 years that she lived, and she's lived in Puritan, New England town, which also encouraged a Calvinist, Orthodox, conservative approach to Christianity. And for people who don't know New England. So New England is a part of the USA which was settled first by people from England, and Dickinson's family is also amongst these first settlers, and they all follow the Puritan sects. And Puritans, and for people who don't know what Puritanism is, um, um, Puritanism is a subset of Protestantism, and these were the people who were opposed to the Church of England. So they did not like how the Anglican Church was shaping up, and they migrated to America, and And why these details are important? Because through her poetry, we see these dilemmas about her imagination of God, and how and her faith, and she seems to keep challenging her own faith and coming back to faith, etc. So the image of God is extremely important. So for people who don't know Calvinism, she was her family and most of her contemporaries and most of her family are Calvinists. And what is Calvinism? Basically, this is a system. This is a theology branch of Christian theology, which believed in predestination, and which believed that man was preconditioned to be doomed. So this idea of sovereignty of God, but depravity of the humankind. And so this is extremely important for her poetry, because she challenges this idea of a tyranny of God, and she does not want to believe in this whole idea of God being a superpower. And in fact, through in her teenage years, she has, she stopped attending church services altogether. So this is, there's this streak of protest in her, which we see very, very early on. And and so she is born in a prominent but not a very rich family. And her great grandfather was one of the founders of the Amherst College, and he built a big house which was called the Homestead. The house was called Homestead. There's a picture of Homestead here, and she mostly stayed in this house through her life, and eventually another house was built close to it, and it was called the Evergreens, and this was the house where her brother would stay. So most of her correspondences, most of her life is spent in this house. And in this other house, you have her brother staying with his sister-in-law, and who was called Susan Gilbert, and she has a very long correspondence with Susan Gilbert as well. So she starts writing in the early 20s, and some of her poems are published early on. Um, and sometimes, and she has two siblings. One is Austin, the brother I was talking about, who lives in the Evergreens, and his younger sister called Lavinia. And so the brothers and the sisters really get along very well, but we do not know much about the mother. And the brother is also very well-to-do, and he becomes an attorney. And wife of Austin is also a budding writer, and both Emily and Susan see themselves as writers. And Emily attended the Amherst Academy, which is actually a school, and she studies variety of subjects. She studies geology, she studies and this is 19th century, so there's a lot of emphasis on science. So we see that again in much of her poetry. You see the way that she writes about flowers, or the way she writes about nature. She's really interested in science, so she studied science in her school. And her interaction with Susan Gilbert is extremely important through her life, because with Susan, she shares this love for poetry, and Susan also writes. Um, Dickinson writes through 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and she's written around 1,800 poems, and 1,100 of which are actually sewed in hand-stitched notebooks. And she begins writing fairly early, but somewhere around 1865, which is fairly towards towards later part of her life, where she stops binding these poems, and she actually sends these poems out to people to read. So the first part until 1858, she's writing to keep these poems, but post 1865, she's actually sending these poems around away to others to get reviews of sorts. And she's really inspired by poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Robert Browning, the Brontes, etc. And and it's 1860s, her reclusiveness increases. We'll talk about her reclusiveness and her later life in the next video. So Dickinson's life after 1860s is pretty much the time when she relegates herself completely to staying at home, which is, as I said, which was called the homestead. So she stays completely in the homestead. Um, and this is also the starting of the most productive times of her poetic journey. So she writes a lot through the 60s. And so we do not know exactly when she started departing from social life and stopped completely socializing with people around. But we know for sure that this is the time when she writes a lot. And this is the time she also talks about a fear of facing the world. And in one of her letters to her mentor, she talks about a certain fear. And 1860s, as we know, is also the time of the Civil War, the American Civil War. And although war doesn't show very stark through her poetry, but uh, she doesn't engage very politically with the Civil War, but she discusses it in the themes that she. So the war has a presence in the themes that she discusses, that she talks about in her poetry. For instance, there is a family friend that she loses in the war, and this is called someone called Fraser Stearns, and her brother had known Fraser Stearns personally, so she feels this loss, and she feels the loss of bereavement. She feels, bereavement and grief very strongly, and she has a very keen understanding and a very profound understanding of grief. And the way she would talk about grief is also stands out. And so war has such a presence. So every time she discusses mortality, or every time she discusses her dilemmas about faith, the Civil War has an oblique presence through these engagements with these themes. And of course, we do not have an active engagement in politics like her contemporary Walt Whitman had. Walt Whitman had famously written "Oh Captain, My Captain" about the death of Abraham Lincoln, right? But she does not show this kind of an engagement, and perhaps women are at that point are not expected to engage too much in politics. And we would discuss about how she is also in a way a product of her times, and yet she's always trying to go beyond the conventions, and the boundaries that are set for her as a woman. Um, and so towards the late in her life, she has a correspondence. So these are the people who had affected her, encouraged her at one point of her life or another. So she has a correspondence with someone called he's a judge. He's an elderly judge called Otis Philip Lord, and he is a Supreme Court judge. And she again has a correspondence with him, and perhaps they share the same interests. They share a love for literature, and this could just be this conjecture, but this could be a late life romance, but we do not know. And through her poetry, we do see, she writes something called the master letters, and she writes something called the master poems. So there is always a presence of an elderly male, not an elderly, but an older male figure in her poetry. And so there are a couple of men she has had correspondences with, which show their presence in much of her poetry. So 1874 is when her father, Edward Dickinson, dies. And even her father's funeral is not attended by her, and she famously looks at the funeral from her room. And so she clearly had some issues with facing the world. But we can't talk, we don't know for sure. And this is the time, she's increasingly being called, being remembered, or being identified as the myth, or someone who was always wearing white. And shortly after the passing of her father, her mother also suffers a stroke. And she suffers a stroke, and her mother is paralyzed and bedridden for a long time. But and the sisters take care of her, care of the mother, and eventually, and so for a long time, the sisters take care of the mother. And we don't know exactly how her relationship with her mother was, but as far as her relationship with her father, there are certain biographical or at least certain critiques of her poem which talk about how she would not like the domineering presence of her father. It seems that the father was a very strong presence, and he was also a politician and a public man in that sense. Um, and so is these so lives are lost in the 1880s, so 1870s. So 1880s are actually a difficult time for her and her family. And Austin, her brother, is Austin and brother, her brother and Susan live next door, and they seem to be having issues in the 1880s. And Austin falls in love with this woman called Mabel Loomis Todd, who eventually will also edit Emily's poems. Um, and so through the 80s, it's mostly the time when she's where her health is frail, and she dies of something called the Bright's disease, which we know as a kidney kind of a kidney ailment, and she dies in 1885. Post 1885, her poems are actually discovered by her sister Lavinia, and although she had instructed her her family members to not, she does not want to get published through her life, and she had instructed her sister to not to destroy her letters or destroy her poems. But clearly Lavinia does not do that, and wants to get her poems published. And her poems are heavily edited post her death, and this is one of the biggest critiques or biggest problems with Emily Dickinson's early poems, because they are edited to such a great extent that they start matching the conventions of those times. They start rhyming um, more perfectly, and Emily Dickinson does not have a perfect rhyming system. She uses slant rhyme. She does not use a proper rhyming pattern. So post her death, her poems are tweaked in a way to fall in line with the poetic conventions of that time. And through her life, 11 of her 1800 poems are actually published, and even amongst these 11 poems, 10 of them are actually published without her complete consent. And she doesn't want to get published, it seems, although she does want to be acknowledged as a good writer and poet. And this is and we know this because she writes to many people, and she sends poetry out. She sends her poetry. She If she has to mourn someone's death, she writes her poetry, and she wants to be recognized as a poet. And she wants to be recognized for her talent as a poet, but she would not want to be looked at as a published poet for some reasons. Um, So let us now look at what are the influences on Emily Dickinson life and writing. So as I had said, that she corresponds with many people, and one of the people she has had a long correspondence with is someone called Thomas Wentworth Higginson. And Higginson is an American minister, an author. He's an anti-slavery abolitionist person, and he's a soldier, and he's also an activist that way. He's also participated in the Civil War, so he is an avant-garde of in that sense. And uh, he would write uh, for the Atlantic, and the Atlantic had actually serialized one of his books, and in the Atlantic he writes a kind of an invitation to young contributors, male or female. And in a response to this kind of this kind of an article that Higginson had written in 1862, that Emily writes to him, sends him four poems and asks if quote unquote, are you too deeply occupied to see if my verse is alive? So she wants some kind of a validation from a person as well known as Higginson. And Higginson, since he is participating in the Civil War. He's actually a soldier in the Civil War. His interaction with her through the Civil War is, his side of correspondence in the Civil War is slightly less, and it seems that she feels distant from the Civil War because she's mostly relegated to her um, close circles. But we do have some poetry where we see some presence or oblique presence, as I said, of the Civil War, and these poems are "It Feels a Shame to Be Alive," or "Drumbeat," or "Victory Comes Late," and this is the most intense period. Most half of her poems are actually written through this time. And it is to Higginson that she describes her fear of not being able to move out. In this she seems to be terrified of something, and this could be a psychological condition, as I said, but we do not know. And perhaps this agoraphobia, there's no sure way of telling what it is. And through to Higginson, she would also stress her solitary nature. She would talk about how her real companions are only the hills, or her dog, or the sundown. And she has also mentioned, the distance that she feels from her parents, to Higginson, and also this, as I was saying, the presence of a very dominating father, um, who would prevent women or prevent the girls from thinking too much or reading too much, etc. So as I said, the fact that she's being conditioned as a woman, at the same time she wants to cut away from the barriers which are inhibiting her. That kind of a dilemma shows through her life and her poetry. So Higginson becomes Dickinson's mentor, who she calls a preceptor, and he also visits her twice in the 70s. And Higginson actually collaborated with Mabel Loomis Todd, and these are the two first editors of Emily Dickinson's poetry, and they really tweak her poetry to fall in line with the punctuation of which was suitable to those times. The other person that has really influenced her is Samuel Bowles, who is the editor-in-chief of the Springfield Republican, and she again writes to him for attaining some kind of validation. And another person that she writes a lot to is someone called Helen Hunt Jackson, who is also a notable writer of that time. And Helen Hunt Jackson is a completely different person from her. The two women had actually, belonged to the same town. But Helen Hunt Jackson eventually became an activist, and she would fight for the rights of Native Americans. But they both seem to share a nice camaraderie with one another. In fact, Jackson had very often asked her, begged her to publish, and had even, published one of her poems, one of Emily Dickinson's poems. And Ellen urges her to publish, but Dickinson doesn't want to be published. So this is about the themes that Emily Dickinson takes in most of her poems. Um, so the theme of spirituality, love for nature, and the preoccupation with death is seen in many of her poems. And her early editions, as I had said, was from editors who did not, who tweaked her poetry, and they had actually divided her poems according to the themes of life, love, nature, time, and eternity. And she writes about these subjects as well. Um, but the thing that we see now in many of her poems is her preoccupation with death, and her preoccupation, her curiosity about what happens after death. And And although she does not take part in public religious life, faith is a big dilemma for her because she keeps writing about the idea of God in her poetry. And style, we know that she is known for a very unconventional style. She is known for long, disruptive dashes. She's known for a slant rhyme. She, rhymes, does not rhyme perfectly. So this is called the approximate rhyme or the slant rhyme. And though she builds very very simple images as well, as we had seen in one of the early poems, like hope is a bird as a bird, but some of her other poems are extremely difficult to gauge because they seem extremely cryptic also. So she's capable of writing both kinds of poetry, and also there is extremely unconventional vocabulary in her poems. So this was a brief on what Emily Dickinson represented as a person, and a very brief note on what her style represented in her times. Thank you.